Hello, everyone. To go along with your web activity on the battles of World War II today, I'm going to do a short little video lecture here on the Holocaust, which is happening at the same time as the events that you're seeing in the web quest. So the Holocaust really starts in earnest in 1933, does not end until the end of World War II, when concentration camps are liberated by Allied forces. So the Holocaust is a genocide. Before I start talking about the specifics of the Holocaust, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what a genocide is and how they usually work. So genocide is the deliberate killing of a large group of people, and usually they have something in common, whether it's their race, ethnicity, religion, culture, language, whatever it is. And there is a organization called Genocide Watch who's been studying these for a long time. And they came up with the 10 stages of genocide to kind of show people what to look for at certain stages to make sure we can stop them before they happen. Instead of giving you all 10, I'm going to kind of sum them up into 3 for our purposes today. So according to them, genocide happens in these stages. So first, the target population of the genocide is separated from the rest of the population. This can happen with propaganda. It could be a figurative separation where people separate the idea of those people in their minds from themselves, or it can be physical. They can be moved to a different part of the country, a different part of a city, and literally physically separated from the rest of the population. In the case of the Holocaust, we will see both, and I'll call them out when we get to those later on in the lecture. The second step, perpetrators take the rights away from the target population. So generally speaking, the second step in this is that the government is involved and they take certain rights away from the population that is being killed in the end of the genocide. In this case, with Germany, it was people of Jewish people. And then last, we have the mass murder phase of a genocide, which kind of explains itself. Okay, so as I go through the Holocaust, I'm going to kind of take you through each step, show you the details of each step, and kind of show you how the Holocaust is not an exception, but it does follow the same pattern that many genocides around the world follow. So the beginning of this particular genocide is the ideology behind it. And so the ideology of the Holocaust is driven by members of the Nazi Party in Germany. And to kind of sum up the ideology that drives this, we have this kind of table here. So we have first, Nazis believed that there was an international Jewish conspiracy to take over the world, so that in some reality, Jews everywhere had coordinated to cause World War I and use it as a lever to gain power around the world in many different countries. Second is that there is a race of people known as Aryans, and that they were superior. They were Nordically based, so you would see the emphasis on blonde hair, blue eyes among some Nazis. Third, that true German heritage was based on blood and soil. So you had German ancestry and you lived on German land. And last, that Europe must be cleansed of the Jewish race in order to return to glory. So essentially, Nazis viewed their mission as stop the international Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. And Adolf Hitler, who leads the Nazi Party in this time period, will lay out a plan to do so. And we will take a look at that plan now. So the first stages is separation, right? And in this case, Nazis start with figurative separation. So they use anti-Semitic propaganda distributed throughout Germany and then later on places that Germany conquered to kind of get their views about Jews to be the popular view of Jews. And so here we have some examples of this, kind of showing the idea that behind everything that's happening, there are Jews, right? That Jewish people are power hungry, they're trying to control the world. And this propaganda was distributed widely and began to change the way Germans viewed Jews living within their country. Eventually, of course, the government gets involved. This would be step 2, right? And this would lead to again, more mental separation, but also start to get into the physical separation parts of these things. So the first thing is the Nuremberg laws. And these were laws that both defined who is Jewish in Germany and also limited the rights of those people. So on the right-hand side, you will see a kind of flow chart, if you will, that Nazis distributed in Germany in this time period. And it is a guide to deciding, okay, so who do we define as the other people, Jewish people, right? And so as you can see in the very right-hand part of that picture, if you had 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents, you were considered fully Jewish. If you had 2 Jewish grandparents, but you identified as Jewish, then you were Jewish. Anything less, and you were not defined as Jewish. But if you happened to be in one of those groups that is outlined in that table, you were limited by the law. So, for instance, Jews were forbidden to own certain kinds of businesses. They could not marry non-Jews any longer. They could not attend certain schools. They could not buy things in certain shops, etc. Violence against Jews will be ramped up in 1935 because a German official is assassinated, and people, of course, pointed their fingers at Jews because of the groundwork that that propaganda laid down. And so after this assassination, people throughout Germany went through the streets and vandalized Jewish businesses, Jewish homes, Jewish synagogues, and in some cases, synagogues on fire would not be put out by firemen. Instead, firemen deployed to the fire would just make sure that the fire did not spread to German-owned. So here in the photographs on the left, you can see some of the aftermath of Kristallnacht. This violence was not just directed towards property. Some Jewish people were killed and beaten. And this kind of signals to the Nazi Party that the propaganda piece of this was successful, and they are ready to start ramping up their plan to solve what they called the Jewish question. The next step was to physically separate people. This is ghettoization. So after that escalation in violence, German officials are able to convince people that the only way to keep them safe is to separate the people who are causing the problems from them. And so parts of German cities everywhere are shut off, and only Jewish people would live in that part. These are called ghettos. It was against the law for a Jewish person to exit or for a German person to enter. And in the pictures you can see they were literal physical barriers guarded by armed guards. And at this point, German officials begin removing Jewish people from ghettos and bringing them to labor camps as part of a plan that Adolf Hitler labeled the Hunger Plan. And so this gets me to the part of this lecture where I have to correct a common misconception among people who like to study World War II. Some people believe that if Hitler had not been so focused on the Holocaust, then Germans might very well have won World War II. And this is something that is inconceivable, because a lot of the reason for World War II to happen was the Holocaust. So part of the purpose of attacking Eastern Europe, for instance, was to carry out the, quote, solution to what Hitler called the Jewish question. And the plan was he was going to take over Eastern Europe to create more Lebensraum, or living space, for Germans. And the invasion of Russia, that people say, well, if he hadn't done that, he would only be fighting France and Britain and it would be easier. That was part of this plan, right? So there is no universe in which Adolf Hitler fights World War II without invading Russia. The plan involved taking control of this area, taking the food from the farms of Eastern Europe, bringing them to Germany and feeding German soldiers in the war front, and intentionally starving the people who lived there. So Eastern Europeans were obviously part of this plan, but a lot of this has to do with the fact that Eastern Europe had a large Jewish population. At the same time, hard labor camps were employed to quicken the results of this plan. So the idea was, if we take Jewish people, we bring them from the ghetto to a concentration camp and force them to do hard labor all day long every day, plus we starve them, it will make this process happen quicker. So this is really the blend here between the mental and physical separation of the two people in Germany and the transition to mass murder here. Hitler's impatience with the fact that the hunger plan takes way longer than he expected is part of the reason we get the next two steps. So by 1942, Hitler realizes that the hunger plan is going to take way longer than he expected. He starts to get nervous about the resources that he's deploying or in this effort, and so he decides to quicken the process even more. And he creates what's called the Einsatzgruppen. This is a special task force that literally went from town to town, rounded up Jewish people, and killed them en masse, buried them in a mass grave, and then went on to the next town. You can find a pretty good documentary on Netflix about the Einsatzgruppen if you do want more information about this. But as you can see on the right, mass murder by the Einsatzgruppen was systematic. They would have the victims dig their own graves, they would kill them in their graves, and then they would cover the graves up and move on. So when people think about the Holocaust and they think about mass murder, most of the time they just picture the gas chambers, the concentration camps, but about 20 to 25% of the deaths in the Holocaust were perpetrated by the Einsatzgruppen in mass killings like this. And then the last step, which Germans would have called the final solution, was the concentration camp, death camp transition. So before this, of course, during the hunger plan, we had hard labor camps as part of that. Starvation was basically the way they decided to kill most people in concentration camps. Because, again, Hitler was unhappy with how fast this was going, they began transitioning lots of hard labor camps into death camps, which means that they installed gas chambers to kill large amounts of people at once. Okay? Crematoriums were also built to hide evidence of this. And so essentially what Germans did was build death factories all throughout Europe, where the idea was it was essentially an assembly line of death, right? We bring people into the gas chamber, we kill them en masse, we bring them to the crematorium, we burn the evidence, and we continue to do this as fast as possible. And as we'll see in the last slide, they are able to kill about 3.2 million people in the various death camps around Europe. And so this is the final step of genocide. And so as we could see through this whole lecture, we started with people mentally separating themselves from the people being targeted, in this case, Germans separating themselves from Jews. This is how we are different. This is why we are different. Then we get to the point where they're blaming them for bad things that are happening in Germany. They're blamed for the Treaty of Versailles that basically crippled the German economy. And there are bad things happening that are easy to pin on the scapegoat. Once that happens, violence increases, and the government begins to increase the pressure by separating people physically in ghettos and starting the hunger plan, which means transitioning them into hard labor camps and attempting to starve them to death, and then ramping up the killing once they realize that it's not happening as fast as they want it to. Okay. So the result, by 1945, Germany is defeated, and camps are liberated throughout Europe by both American and Russian soldiers. People who are found there are emaciated, are in terrible condition. They had been on death marches to try to hide evidence from the liberating armies. But in the end, many camps are liberated by Americans, Russians before they can be evacuated, and plenty of evidence of German war crimes remains, which means they get to try them for their war crimes in the Nuremberg trials after the war. So what is the final toll of the Holocaust? Well, the Einsatzgruppen killed 2 million people, 1.3 million of those were Jews. Gas chambers killed 3.2 million people, 90% of which were Jews. And then the anti-Jewish violence before and during the war brings the Jewish death toll to 6 million people, which is approximately the population of New York City. So a huge effect on these people, and almost entirely successful. Jewish populations throughout Europe totally collapse. And the saddest part, many countries had opportunities to harbor Jewish refugees before any of the violence had emerged, but they were turned away, including the United States. So even though there were many times that countries could have stopped this from happening, none of them took the opportunity, which is part of the reason why Genocide Watch has the 10 stages of genocide up on their website and continue to work to make sure that people are seeing the warning signs before it's too late. Okay, so that is the Holocaust. You need to know this stuff for the quiz coming up on April 27th. After you watch this, you should go do the web quest on World War II battles, and reminder that this is happening simultaneously with what you'll be learning about in that web quest. As always, if you have any questions, you can come to the Google Meet. It happens every day from 1 to 2 p.m. Any world history teacher can answer questions about this or anything else that you're struggling with. And we can all be reached by email or any other forms of contact that your teachers have called your attention to.